Let's be honest. Power doesn't corrupt. It attracts the already corrupted. And in a country founded on rebellion, soaked in contradiction, and marketed as the land of liberty, there's something almost poetic about watching 46 men, yes, all men, climb to the highest office in the land and promptly proceed to do something unspeakable. So tonight, we're not going to talk about leadership or greatness. We're going to talk about the stain each president left behind. Not the most controversial thing, not the most debated, but the most evil thing. The thing that makes you pause and wonder if maybe the cost of running a republic was never really paid. From slave-owning philosophers to Twitter-fueled despots, here's 2 hours of America's most uncomfortable bedtime story. Before we dive in, hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Trust me, you're going to want more of this kind of unsettling. George Washington, the slave dentist. The father of the country had wooden teeth. At least that's what the myth says. The truth? They were likely made from teeth pulled from enslaved people. Washington's dentures, crafted with ivory and human teeth, may have been set with molars bought from the people he legally owned. When he wasn't leading revolutionary armies, he was devising schemes to avoid Pennsylvania's emancipation laws, rotating his slaves in and out of state lines every 6 months so they wouldn't qualify for freedom. Neat trick for a guy who wrote about liberty. He freed his slaves, in his will, after he died, because nothing says moral courage like conditional emancipation post-mortem. He built a nation on freedom while his personal wealth was tied to bondage. And yes, the times were different, but he was Washington, the guy who set precedent. And his precedent was compromise, not justice. Evil in his case wasn't just in the violence of owning people. It was the elegance with which he wrapped it in virtue. The revolution was televised and choreographed, and behind the powdered wigs and parchment was a man who smiled at liberty while counting profits from human bodies. 2. John Adams, the silencer-in-chief. He hated political parties, loved arguing, and spent most of his presidency writing letters. But the most evil thing John Adams did, he made it illegal to criticize him. In 1798, Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, a cluster of laws that allowed the federal government to jail immigrants and fine newspapers for saying mean things. He weaponized national security to crush dissent. Under his watch, Americans were imprisoned for pointing out government corruption. One Vermont congressman got fined $100 for calling Adams's ego out, which, ironically, was a bargain. Adams imagined himself a philosopher king, a noble Roman in a collapsing republic. But what he really became was America's first cancel culture cop. The man who raged against monarchy now jailed poets for satire. He defended it all by saying it protected the country. From what? Mean pamphlets? His laws expired just as he left office, but the damage lingered. He'd set a precedent. If the president doesn't like what you say, he can silence you. In the end, Adams died thinking he was the smartest man in the room. He might have been, but sometimes intelligence just makes the tyranny more efficient. Thomas Jefferson, the philosopher's paradox. Thomas Jefferson was a man of reason, a philosopher-president whose pen carved out the immortal promise that all men are created equal. And then he went home to his plantation and resumed owning people. There's a cruel kind of symmetry to his story. By day, he wrote love letters to liberty. By night, he raped a girl he legally owned. Sally Hemings was around 14 when their relationship began. If we dare use that word. He was over 40. She was his property. She bore his children. But here's where it gets darker. Jefferson knew what he was doing, knew the contradiction. He even wrote about it. Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just. The guilt was there, but not enough to free her, or most of the other 600 plus people enslaved over his lifetime. In public, he called slavery a moral depravity. In private, he used its profits to fund his lavish lifestyle, his Paris soirees, his books, and his French wines. He claimed to oppose the slave trade, while quietly purchasing slaves to avoid breaking them up from families. A softer kind of cruelty, a well-mannered nightmare. He freed a grand total of 7 people in his will, 5 of them his own children. The rest, they were sold off to cover his debts after he died. If hypocrisy had a Mount Rushmore, Jefferson's face would be carved into it. His defenders like to point out the times, the context, the norms. But let's be honest, Even then, people knew it was wrong. That's why he tried to hide his relationship with Sally, why he wrote so many tortured letters about the wolf by the ear. In the end, Jefferson gave the country its founding poetry, then set it on fire by writing liberty with one hand and shackling lives with the other. The man who gave us America's mission statement also buried the evidence beneath Monticello's soft Virginia dirt. And that's the paradox. Not a villain in a cape, but something far worse. A brilliant man who knew better and chose comfort over courage. Welcome to the moral architecture of America. It started with red bricks, black labor, and white lies. James Madison. War and slavery in a gentleman's wig. James Madison was soft-spoken, barely 5'4", and allergic to bees, conflict, and confrontation. And yet, he declared war on the largest empire in the world. The War of 1812 was his baby, and it nearly killed the baby nation. Why? Because the British were impressing American sailors, literally kidnapping them and forcing them into the Royal Navy. Also, Madison wanted to prove that America was a real country now. So, he did what insecure men with power often do. He picked a fight. The war was a disaster. The U.S. tried to invade Canada and got laughed back across the border. Washington, D.C. was burned to the ground. Madison had to flee the capital as the White House was set on fire. He barely escaped with the Constitution, which is ironic considering how much of it he shredded for the war effort. He suspended civil liberties, crushed dissent, oversaw economic collapse, and in the end, the war changed almost nothing, except for the people who died, and the native tribes betrayed. Because, oh yes, Madison also promised Native Americans land rights, then didn't deliver. Again. But let's zoom in on Madison's other legacy. Slavery. He was the last founding father to die, and by the time he did, in 1836, he had never freed a single enslaved person, not even in death. He wrote passionately about liberty and equality, then built his fortune on unpaid black labor at Montpelier, a plantation where he hosted wine-fueled political salons. While people toiled in fields, he never worked. Even worse, when his wife Dolly was widowed, she sold off many of those people to pay her bills. They weren't people to her, they were assets. Even Paul Jennings, Madison's personal manservant, who later wrote a memoir, was sold after decades of service. Eventually, abolitionists bought his freedom. The father of the Constitution died owning over 100 human beings. He drafted the Bill of Rights, but never gave them theirs. So no, Madison wasn't just some bookish founding nerd. He was an architect of contradictions, a liberty-obsessed intellectual who clung to power and property, even when that property bled and prayed and had names. In a powdered wig and whispery voice, he calmly codified a system of elegant horror. James Monroe, the compromiser-in-chief. James Monroe is most remembered for a doctrine. It warned European powers not to interfere in the Americas, a strong statement of hemispheric independence, bold, declarative, imperialistic as hell. But that's not his darkest footprint. His real legacy lies in another doctrine, the Missouri Compromise, a quiet little deal struck in 1820 to keep the peace between free and slave states. What it really did was draw a literal line through the nation. Slavery was okay here, but not there. Civil war wasn't a question of if after that, just when. Monroe knew it was a ticking bomb. He just hoped he'd be dead before it went off. Spoiler, he was. The Missouri Compromise allowed Missouri to join the Union as a slave state in exchange for banning slavery north of the 36 degrees, 30 minutes parallel. It sounded like balance. It was, in fact, a death sentence with polite penmanship, the kind of moral math that says, well, maybe we can share evil and call it justice. But Monroe was a man of compromises. A Virginia slaveholder, he had 75 enslaved people working his plantation while he signed peace treaties about liberty. And he wasn't passive about it. He approved of colonization plans to send free black people to Africa, because if you're not ready to give people rights, maybe just ship them away. He called it benevolent. History calls it displacement with a smile. Even when a rebellion broke out in Virginia, led by enslaved people sick of waiting for freedom, Monroe responded with brute force. Hundreds were arrested, dozens executed. His legacy there? A statue of quiet, rational horror. The thing about Monroe was he wasn't a monster. He was just comfortable with a system that crushed others, comfortable letting the country split into moral territories, comfortable kicking the can down a road that ended in blood. In the so-called era of good feelings, Monroe managed to smile his way through some of the most dangerous decisions in American history. He didn't rant, didn't rage, he compromised. That was the evil. Not in action, but in acquiescence. Sometimes the most dangerous presidents aren't the ones who break things, they're the ones who keep them exactly as they are. John Quincy Adams, the silent slaver. John Quincy Adams was a brain on legs, fluent in 5 languages by age 14, U.S. minister to the Netherlands before he could legally drink, a prodigy turned president, and a walking contradiction. He was morally opposed to slavery, called it a great and foul stain, and yet, like his father, he refused to do anything about it while he had power. His presidency was largely paralyzed. Congress blocked his internal improvements. Political enemies mocked him as an elitist bookworm. He had 4 years to lead a nation and chose to play safe while slavery grew stronger. Now some will say, but he fought for abolition after the presidency. And yes, he did. He returned to Congress and became a bulldog against slavery. He defended the Africans in the Amistad case and made stirring anti-slavery speeches. But we're talking about presidential sins. And during that time, he was silent, passive, deliberately still. He came into office after the corrupt election of 1824, where the House of Representatives handed him the win over Andrew Jackson, prompting Jackson's allies to cry foul. To avoid further controversy, Adams went quiet. He refused to provoke the South, refused to press the issue of slavery. He even supported infrastructure projects that relied on slave labor. At one point, he tried to create a national university that went nowhere. But while he was sketching out ivory towers, real human beings were shackled to real ones. In a letter, he admitted that compromise on slavery may bring down the judgment of heaven. Still, he did nothing to stop it. And when he had the chance, the power, the pen, the podium, he chose caution. Adams may not have whipped slaves or invaded nations, but in the ethical void of his presidency, wrongness thrived. Sometimes evil isn't loud. It's the sound of a brilliant man watching horror through a window and whispering, "Not now." Andrew Jackson, the devil in democracy. Andrew Jackson didn't have a dark side. He was all dark. He arrived on the national stage with a war hero's smile and blood in his teeth. His nickname was Old Hickory, hard as wood and twice as likely to be used as a weapon. He rose from poverty, styled himself as the voice of the common man, so long as that man was white, angry, and didn't mind genocide. Because Jackson's true legacy isn't duels or democracy, it's death marches. The Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed and enforced by Jackson, forced tens of thousands of Native Americans off their ancestral lands. Entire tribes, the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, were marched westward in brutal, freezing conditions. Thousands died from disease, hunger, and exposure. The Cherokee called it the Trail of Tears. Jackson called it progress. He framed it as protection, as saving Native Americans from extinction. He was saving them from extinction by hastening it. Even the Supreme Court ruled against him. In Worcester versus Georgia, the court said the federal government couldn't just bulldoze tribal sovereignty. Jackson's response? John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Translation, try and stop me. And no one did. Jackson was also a plantation owner who enslaved hundreds. He bought, sold, whipped, and punished humans like livestock. He placed newspaper ads offering rewards for escaped slaves, with bonuses for extra violence. He even restructured the economy in ways that punished the poor he claimed to protect. His war on the National Bank triggered a financial collapse and made room for new Southern landowners to buy up territory just cleared of native people. He weaponized democracy, built a cult of personality, stoked populist rage, and left behind a model of rule by blunt force trauma. If Jefferson was the philosopher of American contradiction, Jackson was its iron fist. No more subtle lies. Just pure, visceral cruelty, wrapped in a flag. He didn't bend the rules. He snapped them over his knee. Martin Van Buren, the architect of elegant atrocities. Martin Van Buren was the kind of man who could smile while stabbing you in the back, then issue a polite apology for getting blood on your carpet. Impeccably dressed, meticulously calculating, and slippery as a greased eel in a courtroom, Van Buren was the first American president born into the country, and he used that birthright to help quietly build its ugliest traditions. Known as the Little Magician, he was a master of political machinery, responsible for shaping the modern Democratic Party. His legacy? Not stirring speeches or grand ideologies, but the cold institutionalization of injustice under the veil of normalcy. Let's start with the Trail of Tears, the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans. Jackson gets the infamy, but Van Buren, he executed it, literally. When Jackson left office, the brutal relocation of the Cherokee people was incomplete. Van Buren finished the job, dispatching 7,000 federal troops to round up the Cherokee Nation and force them westward at bayonet point. More than 4,000 died of disease, starvation, and exposure on that journey. Children buried along muddy trails, mothers collapsing beside frozen rivers, and Van Buren called it a success. He wasn't violent, just efficient. Bureaucratic brutality disguised as order. He also had no problem with slavery. Van Buren was a Northern man with Southern sympathies, which is a fancy way of saying he was morally flexible. He owned at least one enslaved person in his youth and, as president, opposed abolitionists and gagged anti-slavery petitions in Congress. His presidency didn't just tolerate the institution, it protected it with fine legal silk. Then came the Panic of 1837, an economic meltdown Van Buren inherited but did little to fix. Banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, breadlines formed, and the president responded with laissez-faire economics. Let the market fix itself, he said. Spoiler, it didn't. Van Buren's sin wasn't flamboyant. It was deeply systemic. He proved that evil doesn't need horns and fire, just a smile, a chair in the Oval Office, and a steady hand to keep the machine running. And when the next election came, the people had had enough of his quiet cruelty. They wanted something different, someone bold, someone loud, someone who'd make them forget the suffering by shouting over it. They got William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison, the 30-day conqueror. William Henry Harrison is mostly remembered for dying a month into his presidency. No real policies, no scandals, just a long-winded inauguration speech in the freezing cold, pneumonia, and a tragic footnote in a dusty civics book. But to reduce him to a corpse with a sash is to let him off easy, because long before he died in the White House, Harrison was knee-deep in another house, the House of Blood built on native land. As governor of the Indiana Territory, Harrison had one job: clear the land, and he did it with paperwork and powder. He signed over millions of acres from native tribes to white settlers using treaties that were, to be kind, wildly coercive. Many of these tribes didn't even understand what they were signing. The ones who resisted faced bullets. His shining moment came in 1811 at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where he attacked Prophetstown, the spiritual center of the pan-native resistance movement led by Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet. Harrison's troops burned it to the ground. The newspapers called him a hero. Native communities called him something else. He parlayed that into political fame. His campaign ran on Tippecanoe and Tyler too, turning genocide into a jingle. The public didn't care that Harrison's entire resume was built on broken treaties and native bones. They just liked the way he rhymed. Then came the inauguration. No coat, no hat, just hubris. He gave the longest speech in presidential history, then died of pneumonia 31 days later. No laws passed, no wars declared, but his brief presidency still marked a turning point. Because what followed wasn't healing, it wasn't reflection, it was a vulture circling the corpse, ready to claim the prize. The first vice president to inherit the office, a man more Southern than the South itself, a walking constitutional crisis, and his name was John Tyler. John Tyler, the president without a country. John Tyler shouldn't have been president. Not legally, not ideologically, not even logistically. He was added to Harrison's ticket to balance the ballot, a Southern pro-slavery Democrat on a Whig platform, a Trojan horse with good posture. But then Harrison died, and Tyler didn't just assume the office, he claimed it like a feudal lord, declared himself the president, not acting president, and set off a constitutional panic. Congress fumed. The Whig Party expelled him. His entire cabinet, minus one, resigned in protest. Tyler didn't blink, because Tyler wasn't here to serve a party. He was here to serve the South. He vetoed a national bank bill twice, leading to riots outside the White House. He slashed Whig economic policy. But his real obsession was expansionism, particularly expanding slavery. His presidency was dominated by one goal: annexing Texas. A massive slaveholding republic, Texas had seceded from Mexico and was begging to join the U.S. Most Northerners opposed the move, fearing it would tip the balance of power. But Tyler didn't care. He wanted to plant a slave empire across the continent. He manipulated foreign policy, leaned on backroom deals, and tried to bypass the Senate altogether to force the annexation through. When it finally succeeded, under Polk, not Tyler, it triggered the Mexican-American War and lit the match on the Civil War. Oh, and if you thought Tyler's love for the Confederacy was a late-stage turn, think again. Decades after leaving office, he joined the Confederate Congress, the only former U.S. president to openly rebel against the United States. When he died in 1862, Lincoln's administration didn't acknowledge it. No national mourning, no funeral honors, just silence. Tyler's grave lies under a Confederate flag, not an American one. If Harrison was the president who barely lived, Tyler was the one who lived too long enough to betray every principle of union he once swore to uphold. And yet, the next man would go even further, taking Texas, taking Mexico, and taking lives, lots of them. His name was James K. Polk, and he was manifest destiny in human form. Still with me? Good. That means you're the kind of person who enjoys peeling back layers that were never meant to be touched. Like, subscribe and keep going. We're nowhere near done. James K. Polk, the landlord of American empire. James K. Polk was not a particularly charismatic man. His forehead was too big, his smile too tight, and his speeches sounded like term papers read aloud. But what he lacked in charm, he made up for with ambition, the manifest kind. He promised to serve one term, conquer massive swaths of land, and then disappear. And disturbingly, he kept every promise. Under Polk, the United States grew by over 1 million square miles. He annexed Texas, provoked Mexico into war, took California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado. The Mexican-American War was a geopolitical land grab disguised as patriotism, and it worked like a charm. Here's how. Polk sent U.S. troops into disputed territory along the Rio Grande. Mexico considered it an invasion. They fired. Polk told Congress, "American blood has been shed on American soil." War followed. Swift, bloody, and devastating. Over 13,000 American soldiers died. Mexican casualties, roughly 25,000 to 30,000, including civilians, cities razed, homes torched, bodies buried in shallow, sun-cooked graves. Also, Polk could redraw the map. Even some of Polk's contemporaries were horrified. A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln called the war unnecessarily and unconstitutionally begun. Ulysses S. Grant, who fought in it, later wrote, "I do not think there was ever a more wicked war." But Polk didn't care about morality. He cared about destiny, manifest destiny, the belief that God wanted the U.S. to spread from coast to coast, no matter who lived there. Native tribes, move them. Mexicans, conquer them. Morality, edit it. And then there was slavery. Every new territory meant one question: would it be slave or free? Polk never explicitly said he wanted to expand slavery, but he appointed pro-slavery governors and just happened to make policy decisions that favored Southern interests. Funny that. He left office after one term, exactly as promised. No scandals, no blunders, just a map soaked in ink and blood. He died 3 months later. James K. Polk is proof that you don't have to rant or rave to be dangerous. You can be polite, efficient, quietly obsessed with maps, and still leave a scar on the world. But what happens when that land he conquered gets handed to a man who has no idea what to do with it? Enter Zachary Taylor, a war hero president who bled in Mexico and then bled out politically in Washington. Zachary Taylor, the accidental martyr. Zachary Taylor was elected president because he killed enough people to qualify as a national hero. That's not a metaphor. He earned his nickname, Old Rough and Ready, by leading troops in the Mexican-American War, where he painted the deserts with blood and rode home with medals. He had never voted in an election, had never held political office, and didn't really understand the Constitution. But Americans love a uniform and a myth, and Taylor had both. The irony, once in office, he tried to do the right thing. Taylor opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories Polk had just ripped from Mexico. He wasn't an abolitionist, mind you. He owned slaves, but he believed the Union came first. He told the southern states threatening secession to back off, or he'd personally lead the army against them. This understandably made people nervous, especially when Taylor started pushing for California and New Mexico to skip the territorial phase and become free states immediately. The South, foaming at the mouth, saw this as a direct threat to their slaveholding future. Congress gridlocked, rhetoric sharpened, the country hovered on the edge of civil war, and then, just like that, Taylor dropped dead. Officially, a bad case of gastroenteritis from eating spoiled cherries and iced milk at a 4th of July event. Unofficially, some speculate poisoning. A president who had dared to challenge the slaveocracy, conveniently gone. He lasted 16 months. And with his death came a shift. Taylor may have been crude, but he had held the line. His vice president, however, had no such spine. Millard Fillmore stepped in, polished his lapel, and promptly folded to the South. Millard Fillmore, the smiling executioner of compromise. Millard Fillmore always looked like he'd been carved out of beeswax and antique regret. A man so forgettable he's remembered solely for being forgettable, until you open the books and realize he did something truly horrific. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Imagine this. You've escaped slavery, you've traveled hundreds of miles north, risking capture, torture, death. You've built a new life in Ohio or Pennsylvania. You've started a family, found hope. Then Fillmore comes along and makes it federal law that you can be hunted, dragged back across state lines, and re-enslaved. With no trial, no defense, no proof required beyond someone's accusation. Worse still, ordinary citizens in free states were now legally obligated to help slave catchers. If you refused, you could be jailed. Fillmore didn't just legalize oppression, he outsourced it to your neighbors. He said it was about preserving the Union. In reality, it was appeasement by way of human sacrifice. The Compromise of 1850, which Fillmore so proudly enforced, temporarily calmed the sectional crisis, but at what cost? It empowered kidnappers, undermined state sovereignty, radicalized abolitionists, and turned the Underground Railroad into a national emergency. Fillmore's moral compass wasn't broken. It was purchased. After leaving office, he joined the Know Nothing Party, a nativist anti-immigrant group that hated Catholics almost as much as it hated foreigners. So much for liberty. Fillmore never saw himself as a villain. He fancied himself a unifier, a balancer, a preserver of peace. But peace built on bondage isn't peace. It's a prison. And the next man would break the locks. Not with fire, but with policy. Cold, meticulous, and deadly. Enter Franklin Pierce, the president who smiled through civil collapse. Franklin Pierce, the bleeding smiler. Franklin Pierce was handsome, well-dressed, soft-spoken, and a total catastrophe in a suit. A Northern Democrat with Southern loyalties, Pierce didn't just fail to prevent the Civil War. He poured gasoline on it, then signed his name with a practiced grin. His presidency began with a curse. Literally. On the way to his inauguration, his only surviving child, 11-year-old Benny, was decapitated in a train crash right in front of him. Pierce and his wife never recovered. Jane descended into spiritualism and mourning. Pierce descended into whiskey. But his true haunting wasn't personal. It was political. Enter the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Pierce signed it into law, gutting the Missouri Compromise and opening the door for slavery to expand into the West, under the false pretense of popular sovereignty. Translation: let the locals vote on whether humans should be property. What followed was a national moral collapse. Kansas became a literal battlefield. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded the territory, burning homes, looting towns, executing rivals in cornfields. They called it Bleeding Kansas. And Pierce? He did nothing. Worse, he recognized a pro-slavery puppet government despite the clear signs of fraud and bloodshed. His moral compass didn't just break. He threw it into a river. Abolitionists begged for federal protection. Pierce sent federal troops to aid the pro-slavery forces to reinforce the illusion of legitimacy while the soil turned red. Meanwhile, he enforced the Fugitive Slave Act with brutal rigor. His administration prosecuted anti-slavery activists, hunted down escaped slaves, and punished anyone who dared help them. When the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, denying citizenship to Black Americans and declaring slavery could not be restricted anywhere, Pierce applauded. He said it would end the controversy forever. It didn't. And what did the man do after leaving office? He opposed Lincoln, supported the Confederacy in whispers, became a political ghost, wandering New Hampshire, drinking heavily, writing letters to Jefferson Davis. Franklin Pierce left the country splintered, bleeding, and morally bankrupt. But if Pierce was the arsonist, the next man was the fireman who refused to bring water. James Buchanan, the human surrender flag. James Buchanan believed in the Constitution the way a drowning man believes in the ocean, with a mix of awe, fear, and total paralysis. By the time he took office in 1857, the country was already on a slow-motion collision course with itself. Buchanan decided his role was to stand very still and let it happen. He's often ranked among the worst presidents in American history, and that's not hyperbole. He inherited a nation in crisis and made every wrong move possible, not out of malice, but from a toxic blend of legalism, cowardice, and selective loyalty. He believed slavery was morally wrong, but also believed the federal government had no right to interfere with it. That contradiction defined his presidency. He supported the Dred Scott decision, even though it effectively declared Black Americans had no rights at all. He pressured the Supreme Court behind the scenes to reach its infamous conclusion, a fact that only emerged later. In Kansas, he backed a pro-slavery constitution written by a handful of settlers, ignoring the majority who opposed it. When Congress pushed back, he labeled them radicals. Meanwhile, violence continued. Buchanan's idea of leadership was writing long letters while the Union cracked underfoot, but his crowning disgrace came at the end. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected. South Carolina immediately seceded, then Mississippi, then Florida, then Alabama, then Georgia. Buchanan's response? They can't secede, but I can't stop them either. He left office with 7 states in rebellion, federal forts under siege, and 0 action taken. He said force would be unconstitutional, so instead, he handed Lincoln the keys to a country already on fire. Even the Confederates didn't respect him. Even his own party dumped him. When asked if he bore any responsibility for the Civil War, he said history would vindicate him. It didn't. James Buchanan wasn't a villain. He was something arguably worse, a bystander-in-chief so paralyzed by fear of taking sides that he let the Republic rot. But the man who followed, he took sides, took fire, took blood. Abraham Lincoln didn't walk into a presidency, he walked into a war. Abraham Lincoln, the emancipator with iron hands. Abraham Lincoln is the closest thing America has to a secular saint. The tall man with the sad eyes, the orator with a voice made for tombstones, the president who saved the Union and freed the slaves. But Lincoln's legacy isn't just carved in marble. It's written in blood, executive orders, and unforgivable decisions. Let's start with the good. He did eventually sign the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that didn't free all enslaved people, but shifted the war's moral center. He did preserve the Union. He did speak words that redefined the soul of a nation. But to get there, Lincoln shredded the Constitution. He suspended habeas corpus, giving himself the power to arrest and detain citizens indefinitely. Thousands were imprisoned without trial. Dissenting newspapers shut down. Critics jailed. Border states occupied. The Bill of Rights went into storage. Temporarily, he said. He authorized military tribunals for civilians, overruled state governments, waged total war in the South, not just against armies, but infrastructure, farms, and homes. Sherman's march to the sea, Grant's siege of Vicksburg, they were brutal, scorched earth campaigns that broke the Confederacy's will and broke countless families in the process. And all of it, the suspension of rights, the carnage, the political brinkmanship, was done to preserve the Union, to hold the country together at any cost. Even Lincoln himself knew the price. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. Moral clarity came later, and yet, by the time of his death, he had become something mythic, a president who rose from poverty, guided the country through hell, and paid for it with a bullet. But he left behind questions without answers. What does it mean to save a country by suspending its freedoms? How do you free people in a nation built to keep them shackled? His successor wouldn't rise to that challenge. He would drag the corpse of Reconstruction into the grave beside Lincoln's. Next, Andrew Johnson, the man who broke the second chance. Let's walk into the smoldering aftermath of Civil War, where freedom was promised in ink, but drowned in blood and bureaucracy. These next three presidents didn't just fumble the reconstruction of America. They bulldozed it in slow motion. We begin with Andrew Johnson, the great saboteur. Andrew Johnson was a tailor by trade, the son of poverty, self-educated, Southern by blood, but Unionist by politics. When Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson stepped into the presidency as a symbol of cross-sectional unity, the Southern Democrat who stayed loyal to the Union. Within months, he became its greatest internal threat. Johnson wasn't just indifferent to the cause of black freedom. He was openly hostile to it. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, opposed the 14th Amendment, and blocked efforts to protect formerly enslaved people from the rising tide of white supremacist violence. His logic? That the South had suffered enough, that reuniting the Union meant forgiving the traitors, not rebuilding the victims, and so he pardoned thousands of ex-Confederates, returning their land, their rights, and in many cases, their political offices. Men who had taken up arms against the United States were soon writing the laws of the New South. Black Americans, freshly emancipated, watched as their so-called freedom was redefined into sharecropping contracts, poll taxes, black codes, and lynching trees, and Johnson did nothing. Worse, he used the power of the presidency to stop Congress from intervening. He vetoed Freedmen's Aid, fired Reconstruction officials, and when Congress pushed back, he claimed it was he who was being oppressed. He picked a public fight with the Republican-led Congress, culminating in his firing of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, an action that triggered his impeachment. Johnson became the first U.S. president to face trial in the Senate. He survived by one vote. The damage was incalculable. By the time he left office, the South had begun to rebuild itself in the same white supremacist image it had before the war, just with new language and less paperwork. Reconstruction hadn't failed. It had been sabotaged, and when asked if black Americans deserved citizenship, Johnson once replied, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I am president, it shall be a government for white men." He wasn't a misstep in history. He was a hand grenade. But the next man? He was different. He'd been to war, seen what freedom cost. He had the scars and the silence to prove it. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, and for a moment, just a brief moment, justice almost got a fighting chance. Ulysses S. Grant, the general who couldn't govern. Ulysses S. Grant had seen death up close, from the soaked hills of Shiloh to the blood rivers of Vicksburg. As a Union general, he had broken the Confederacy. As president, he tried to break its ghost, and for a time he almost did. Grant took office in 1869, and unlike his predecessor, actually cared about Reconstruction. He backed the 15th Amendment, which granted black men the right to vote. He sent federal troops to the South to crush the Ku Klux Klan, jailing hundreds and temporarily dismantling its terror network. He appointed black Americans to federal office. He fought for civil rights. But here's the problem with noble intentions. If your house is rotting, good furniture won't fix it. Grant's presidency was plagued by corruption, not from him, but from the people he trusted. His appointments were loyal friends and war comrades, not competent statesmen. And the grift spread like a virus. There was the whiskey ring, a massive scheme involving government officials stealing tax revenue from liquor sales. There was the Indian ring, where bribes were exchanged for tribal land contracts. There were financial scandals, railroad bribes, and fraudulent gold schemes. Grant's response? Often too little, too late. He valued loyalty over accountability. His loyalty blinded him, and in the background, the South waited. As Grant's administration drowned in scandal, Southern Democrats rebuilt their power block by block. Federal troops were pulled back. Election violence returned. White supremacist militias rebranded. The tide reversed. Grant spent 8 years fighting the tide. But his grip loosened with every scandal. His moral compass was firm, but his ship was full of holes. He left office exhausted, broke, and disgraced, yet still more dignified than what came next, because the next president didn't just let the South reclaim its throne, he handed them the crown. Rutherford B. Hayes, the gentleman who closed the coffin. Rutherford B. Hayes was a Union general, clean-cut and quietly righteous. He didn't drink, he didn't swear. He called his wife Lemonade Lucy because she banned alcohol from the White House. But behind that polite veneer lies one of the coldest political betrayals in American history. The election of 1876 was a deadlock of chaos. Hayes, Republican, versus Samuel Tilden, Democrat. Tilden won the popular vote, but 3 Southern states submitted disputed returns, rife with intimidation, violence, and fraud. Sound familiar? To resolve the crisis, a bipartisan commission was formed. In secret, a deal was struck. The Compromise of 1877. Hayes would become president. In exchange, he would withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. He agreed, and with that one decision, the United States officially abandoned Black Americans to the mercy of their former enslavers. Freedmen were beaten, driven from polling stations, or killed outright. Jim Crow laws began to rise. Lynching surged. Schools were defunded. Black political power was crushed, not slowly, but in a single silent handoff. Hayes defended the deal as necessary to restore order. But order for whom? He said he would protect civil rights, then refused to send troops when Black communities begged for help. The freedmen who had fought for the Union, who had voted Republican, who had tried to build lives under the law, were left defenseless. And when historians look back on Reconstruction's death, they don't mark it with a battle. They mark it with Hayes's handshake. He retired with dignity, gave speeches about education, but the truth hung over him like a shroud. He closed the coffin lid on Reconstruction and called it unity. The next few presidents would fiddle while America institutionalized its racial caste system. But before we get to them, a brief glimmer of radical labor, bloody protests, and presidential crackdowns. Let's dive into the next triad of quiet chaos, where the presidency becomes a revolving door of assassinations, backroom deals, and reform that usually meant making sure the same people stayed in charge. These 3 presided over a nation riddled with corruption, worker uprisings, and the slow death of Reconstruction ideals. James A. Garfield, the reformist who bled for merit. James A. Garfield never wanted to be president. He was a professor, a general, and a lifelong idealist who accidentally stumbled into the nomination, like a man who walked into the wrong meeting and was too polite to leave, and that politeness got him killed. Garfield entered office in 1881 with one moral obsession: civil service reform. At the time, government jobs were handed out like party favors. The spoils system. You supported a winning candidate, you got a job. Qualifications be damned. Competence optional. Corruption inevitable. Garfield wanted to stop that. He believed in merit, in professionalism, in taking a hammer to the patronage networks that turned Washington into a swamp long before that term became a hashtag. One man didn't like that. Charles J. Guiteau, a delusional office seeker who believed Garfield owed him an ambassadorship. When he didn't get one, Guiteau shot Garfield in the back at a DC train station. Garfield didn't die immediately. He lingered for 80 days in agony while doctors dug into him with unsterilized hands, probing for the bullet. He likely would have survived if they hadn't. But this was a time when medicine was more guesswork than science. During those weeks, the country watched its president rot, literally in bed. Newspapers published updates. Prayers were printed. The nation held its breath. And while Garfield lay dying, his enemies sharpened their knives. His murder became a weapon, not of national sympathy, but political realignment. The very spoils system he tried to dismantle would kill him. And in death, he became a martyr for the movement he barely had time to build. His presidency was the second shortest in U.S. history, but his murder would finally force Congress to act, not because they cared, but because they were scared they might be next. And so came the next man, a political creature, birthed from the very system Garfield hated, a man with mutton chops, money, and a miracle of transformation. Chester A. Arthur, the man no one expected to grow a spine. Chester A. Arthur, the accidental reformer. Chester A. Arthur entered the presidency with a resume soaked in corruption. He was known as the quartermaster of the spoil system, a man who had used his post at the New York Custom House to reward cronies and get rich doing it. When Garfield died, the country panicked. The man who'd now hold the highest office in the land was a party hack, a political parasite, a man whose only talent seemed to be wearing sharp waistcoats and remembering who owed him favors. But then something happened. Arthur changed. Maybe it was the pressure. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the ghost of Garfield breathing down his neck. Whatever the reason, President Arthur, the patronage king, championed civil service reform. In 1883, he signed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which required government jobs to be awarded on merit, not political connections. It was the beginning of the modern civil service, and a dagger in the heart of the spoils system that had once fed him. It was one of the most unexpected political transformations in U.S. history, and it came at a cost. Arthur alienated his own party, lost his patron network, and despite his accomplishments, was denied a second nomination. The machine he once served turned its back on him. But for all his growth, Arthur was still a man of his time. He did nothing to challenge the growing power of monopolies, nothing to address the economic divide, and nothing for Black Americans whose civil rights were being dismantled piece by piece across the South. And so, as the Gilded Age bloomed, with its factories, robber barons, and sweatshop labor, Arthur stood silent, a better man than expected, but not the man the country needed. Which brings us to the next chapter, a man who would be elected twice, separated by 4 years, and use both terms to punish the poor and crush workers with federal force. Say hello to Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland, the president who crushed the poor. Grover Cleveland was a lawyer's lawyer, dull, stern, and about as warm as a granite slab. He believed in small government, fiscal restraint, and a kind of moral bookkeeping that made human suffering look like bad budgeting. He vetoed more bills than all his predecessors combined, often killing legislation designed to help the most vulnerable. He believed giving federal aid would create dependency. His most infamous veto, a bill to provide food aid to drought-stricken farmers in Texas. His logic, though the people support the government should not support the people. That line would later be chiseled into the philosophy of American conservatism. But Cleveland's real villainy came during his second term, when the country collapsed into the Panic of 1893, the worst economic depression in U.S. history up to that point. Unemployment soared, banks failed, bread lines formed, and Cleveland responded with lectures about the gold standard. Then came the Pullman strike in 1894. Workers for the Pullman Company, a factory town in Illinois, went on strike after wage cuts and rising rents. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, backed them with a national boycott of Pullman rail cars. Cleveland's response? Send in federal troops. The strike turned violent. Dozens were killed. Debs was arrested. The labor movement was crippled. Why? Because the trains carried U.S. mail, and Cleveland claimed it was his duty to protect commerce. In truth, he chose capital over labor, order over justice, the elite over the working class. And let's not forget, Cleveland fathered a child with a woman 30 years younger, tried to discredit her, then adopted the child only after press backlash. His defenders spun it as honor. His critics called it coercion. Grover Cleveland left the White House with the working class crushed, race relations ignored, and federal power redefined as a club to beat the desperate into submission. He was succeeded by a human iceberg with a fondness for tariffs, a man who would help ignite a war with sugar, politics, and the most colonial mustache ever grown. Benjamin Harrison, the cold crusader for corporate Christendom. Benjamin Harrison was not a loud man. He had the voice of a church deacon and the eyes of someone who would call the cops on your lemonade stand. And while he lacked charisma, he more than made up for it in legislative firepower, often in ways that made the average citizen wish Congress had just stayed home. Elected with a minority of the popular vote in 1888, Harrison leaned hard into the power of the pen and the pocketbook. His crowning legislative achievement? The McKinley tariff of 1890, a bill that jacked up import taxes to historically high levels, making everything from sugar to shoes significantly more expensive for the average American. The idea was to protect American industries. What it actually did was inflate prices, cut wages, and trigger a consumer backlash so vicious it handed the Democrats a landslide victory in the next election. But that's just economics. Harrison's real legacy lies in the Wounded Knee Massacre. In 1890, during the final months of his presidency, U.S. troops surrounded a Lakota encampment in South Dakota. Tensions were high, thanks in part to the government's paranoia about the ghost dance movement, a spiritual revival among native tribes that the U.S. interpreted as a call to insurrection. The soldiers opened fire. Over 250 Lakota were killed, the majority women and children. Many were shot in the back, fleeing. The rest were buried in a mass grave in the snow. It was, by every definition, a massacre, and Harrison's administration called it a battle. The soldiers involved received 20 medals of honor, a perverse reward for what should have been national shame. This was the closing act of the Indian Wars, and Harrison, the upright Presbyterian, presided over it with the same moral detachment he brought to his tariffs. He also expanded the Navy, annexed strategic islands in the Pacific, looking at you, Midway, and made clear that America's future was going to be very global, very military, and very white. And the man who would inherit this new militarized economy, he was shorter, slicker, and smelled like money. His name was William McKinley, and he sold war like it was a product. William McKinley, the department store dictator. William McKinley looked like your friendly neighborhood banker, because that's essentially what he was, a corporate comfort blanket in human form, polite, professional, always prepared to explain why war was necessary for the economy. Under McKinley, America stopped being a republic and started acting like a brand. He came to power in 1896 at the peak of the Gilded Age, backed by industrial titans like Mark Hanna and railroad barons who liked their presidents pliable and pro-business. And McKinley delivered. He cut deals, not throats. Unless, of course, you lived in Cuba, Puerto Rico, or the Philippines. Enter the Spanish-American War, a conflict sparked by the suspicious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The press, led by William Randolph Hearst's yellow journalism machine, whipped the country into war frenzy. McKinley, ever the pragmatist, followed the tide. In 1898, the U.S. went to war with Spain. It lasted 10 weeks. The U.S. emerged victorious. And suddenly, McKinley found himself with a global empire. He annexed Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii, spinning it as a civilizing mission. His explanation for keeping the Philippines: there was nothing left for us to do but to take them all, and to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them. Translation: we took them. Deal with it. But Filipinos weren't looking to be civilized. They were looking to be free. They'd already declared independence from Spain. So when the U.S. claimed sovereignty, a brutal guerrilla war broke out. The Philippine-American War was longer and bloodier than the one against Spain. Upwards of 200,000 Filipino civilians died. U.S. troops used waterboarding, burned villages, and herded civilians into disease-ridden camps. McKinley called it benevolent assimilation, the kind of phrase you invent when your bayonets are too shiny. Back home, McKinley embodied the businessman's presidency. He defended trusts, opposed labor reform, and treated working-class unrest like a security issue, until one day an anarchist walked up to him at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo and shot him in the stomach. McKinley lingered for over a week, insisting everything would be fine. It wasn't. And when he died, the presidency passed to a man unlike any other, a war hero, a rich kid with a taste for violence, a reformer who liked a good fistfight. Theodore Roosevelt was here, and he brought the big stick. Theodore Roosevelt, the fist in the velvet glove. Theodore Roosevelt didn't walk into rooms. He charged into them. He didn't whisper policy. He shouted it through a mustache and molars. He was the first modern president, the first to understand that the office wasn't just about policy. It was a stage, a platform, a pulpit, and he used it to redefine power, both at home and abroad. Roosevelt was a progressive, yes, but his progress had limits. He busted trusts and championed national parks, but he also believed in social Darwinism, American exceptionalism, and the moral superiority of Western power. He once said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are." He was a man of contradictions, reading poetry one moment, pushing for war the next. TR's imperial resume is impressive, if you like your patriotism dipped in conquest. He orchestrated the seizure of Panama from Colombia to build the canal, a move so illegal even Congress had to pretend it hadn't noticed. He paraded the U.S. Navy around the globe like a muscle-flexing bully. He believed that civilized nations had a duty to police the uncivilized world, especially in Latin America and the Pacific. He called it the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Everyone else called it colonialism. But Roosevelt also knew how to play hero. He was the first president to invite a black man to dine at the White House, Booker T. Washington, and it caused national outrage. He didn't do it again. He supported some labor rights, but crushed others when they threatened the system. He was a man who loved righteous violence. As long as he got to define the righteousness, he said he was building an America that was stronger, nobler, more honorable. But the truth, he was building an empire and painting it red, white, and blue. And when he left office, he handpicked his successor, a man he thought would continue the crusade. But William Howard Taft was slower, fatter, and far more boring. And soon, Teddy would regret everything. William Howard Taft, the friendly bulldozer. William Howard Taft didn't want to be president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court, wearing a robe and disappearing into law books. Instead, he got stuck in a job he found humiliating, and the nation paid for his boredom. Handpicked by Theodore Roosevelt, Taft was supposed to be the faithful steward of progressivism. Instead, he became its reluctant executioner. He began his term in 1909 with a war chest and a polite smile, but he quickly proved that reform requires more than manners. Taft's presidency was defined by a pattern. He'd promise one thing, then deliver the opposite. He claimed to be antitrust, then busted twice as many monopolies as Roosevelt, sometimes without understanding the broader impact. Wall Street panicked, industrialists screamed, and Taft shrugged, confused that no one was happy. Then came the Payne-Aldrich tariff, a messy, lobbyist-laden bill that raised import taxes and betrayed his progressive base. Taft signed it, defended it, then acted surprised when Roosevelt started sharpening a political knife behind his back. On race, Taft was no friend. He resegregated federal offices, quietly undoing years of progress. He believed African Americans should earn their rights slowly and that their economic growth should come first. Civil rights? Later, maybe. Not a priority. And then there's his foreign policy, a polite euphemism for imperial capitalism. Taft called it dollar diplomacy. The idea was simple. Instead of sending troops, send bankers. Instead of invasions, use loans and corporations to make weaker nations economically dependent on the U.S. Nicaragua, Honduras, Haiti all became playgrounds for American financiers, and when local governments resisted, troops followed the dollars. He used soft words, but his policies had hard consequences. A softer colonialism that still bled. By 1912, Taft had alienated Roosevelt, the progressives, and most of the public. Roosevelt ran against him as a third-party candidate. The vote split, and the door opened for a new kind of leader. A professor, a philosopher king, a man with lofty ideals and an icy heart. Woodrow Wilson was coming, and he would bring segregation, war, and global sermons, all in one terrible, articulate package. Woodrow Wilson, the racist idealist. Woodrow Wilson believed in moral clarity, in God's will, in the divine mission of America to reshape the world. He also believed that black people should know their place, that dissent was dangerous, and that war, as long as it was well-worded, could be righteous. Wilson came to power in 1913 as a progressive Democrat, promising reforms, peace, and a new freedom. And to his credit, he did sign antitrust laws, labor protections, and the Federal Reserve Act. He was an intellectual, a reformer, a university president turned prophet. But the moral center of Wilson's presidency was deeply cracked. One of his first acts, segregating the federal government. Offices that had been racially integrated since Reconstruction were suddenly split by race. Black employees demoted, fired, or walled off behind curtains. Wilson claimed this was for efficiency. His cabinet called it restoring order. He praised Birth of a Nation, a film that depicted the Ku Klux Klan as heroic saviors. It was the first movie ever screened at the White House, Wilson's comment, "It is like writing history with lightning." His administration arrested civil rights activists, silenced black newspapers, and empowered Southern racists for decades to come. But Wilson's most infamous sins came during World War I. He ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Months later, he plunged the U.S. into it, claiming it was a war to make the world safe for democracy. At home, democracy withered. Wilson signed the Espionage Act, leading to thousands of arrests for anti-war speech. Newspapers were shuttered. Socialist leader Eugene V. Debs was sentenced to 10 years in prison for giving a speech criticizing the draft. Wilson's idealism came with censorship, propaganda, and internment camps for alien enemies. And after the war, when Europe lay shattered, Wilson rolled into Versailles with a 14-point sermon on peace and justice. He preached self-determination, but not for the colonies. He preached democracy, but refused to support the black soldiers returning home to segregation and lynching. And when the League of Nations failed, Wilson blamed everyone but himself. He suffered a stroke in 1919, becoming functionally incapacitated, while his wife ran the government in secret. Woodrow Wilson died believing he was the architect of global peace, but he left behind a dismantled civil rights movement, a surveillance state, and a foreign policy doctrine America still uses to justify wars. The next president would have no interest in sermons. Warren G. Harding liked poker, whiskey, and women who weren't his wife. He was the hangover after Wilson's war fever. Warren G. Harding, the president who couldn't say no. Warren G. Harding once said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." For once, a president told the truth. Elected in 1920 on a platform of return to normalcy, Harding was the country's attempt to erase World War I with cigars, jazz, and a gallon of bootleg whiskey. He promised stability. What he delivered was historic corruption, a dead mistress, and a funeral for the progressive era. Harding was affable, handsome, and deeply indecisive. He was more interested in playing poker in the White House with his Ohio cronies, the so-called Ohio Gang, than in governing. And while he played cards, they sold off the country piece by piece. The most infamous scandal? Teapot Dome. Secretary of the Interior Albert Fall leased federal oil reserves, including Teapot Dome in Wyoming, to private oil companies in exchange for bribes, over $400,000 in 1920s money. When the story broke, it became the worst government scandal in U.S. history up to that point. But Teapot Dome was just one of many. Veterans Bureau? Embezzlement. Justice Department? Bribes and kickbacks. Prohibition enforcement? A joke. Harding's own friends ran liquor out of the White House basement. And then there was Nan Britton, Harding's 23-year-old mistress, who gave birth to his child and later wrote a tell-all memoir describing their trysts in White House closets. For decades, people called her a liar. Then DNA tests proved she wasn't. Harding's one consistent political philosophy was, don't rock the boat. On race, labor, and the rise of the KKK, he did nothing. On economic inequality, nothing. On civil rights, he gave one mild speech in Birmingham and moved on. He died suddenly in 1923, possibly of a heart attack, possibly not. Some suspected poison. Conspiracies swirled. The nation mourned, and then promptly discovered his cabinet was a crime scene. Harding's legacy? A lesson in what happens when a nation wants comfort more than conscience. And his successor? A man so silent people thought he ceased to exist between public appearances. Calvin Coolidge, the quiet executioner of change. Calvin Coolidge made a career out of saying nothing and doing less. His nickname? Silent Cal. His personality? Dry as Prohibition gin. His philosophy? The less the government does, the better. He once said, "The business of America is business." And then he spent 5 years proving it. Coolidge entered the presidency after Harding's sudden death and immediately set about cleansing the office, cosmetically, not morally. He cleaned up the corruption, yes, but left the system that enabled it untouched. He cut taxes, slashed regulations, and stood back as the stock market ballooned into a cartoonish bubble. Wall Street became America's new cathedral. Bankers were gods. And Coolidge? Their silent priest. He vetoed farm relief bills during a collapsing agricultural market, saying it wasn't the government's job to help. He did nothing to halt the rampant racial segregation lynching, and Ku Klux Klan resurgence across the South. His version of equality was limited to well-dressed men shaking hands in smoke-filled rooms. Coolidge also signed the Immigration Act of 1924, one of the most aggressively xenophobic laws in U.S. history. It capped immigration based on national origin quotas, targeting Southern and Eastern Europeans, and outright banning Asians. It was white supremacy in legislative form, dressed up in the language of preserving American identity. He claimed to love the Constitution, but what he really loved was leaving things alone, especially when people were suffering. His America was one of polished silence, trains running on time, profits soaring, jazz blaring, all while the economic floor was rotting beneath it. When asked why he did so little, Coolidge said, "4/5 of all our troubles would disappear if we would only sit down and keep still." In 1929, he sat down permanently, didn't run for another term, retired into obscurity. He left behind a ticking time bomb of debt, inequality, and corporate gambling. The explosion came under the next man's watch, and Herbert Hoover never stopped insisting that everything was going just fine. Herbert Hoover, the engineer of empty promises. Herbert Hoover was a self-made man, born poor, rose to global prominence as a mining engineer, humanitarian, food relief organizer during World War I, brilliant, compassionate, logical, and utterly incapable of understanding that logic cannot soothe starvation. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Hoover was just months into his presidency. The crash wasn't the result of a single bad decision. It was decades of laissez-faire neglect, turbocharged by Coolidge's willful silence. But Hoover bore the weight. He believed in rugged individualism, the idea that Americans could lift themselves by their bootstraps, even when their boots had been repossessed and their farms had turned to dust. His response to the Great Depression, conferences, optimism, private partnerships, no direct federal relief, no food programs, no job guarantees. And when people begged for help, he told them to pray, or work harder, or wait. Homeless encampments sprung up across the country. They were dubbed Hoovervilles, shantytowns built by people who had once owned homes. Starvation crept across rural America. Children scavenged, banks collapsed, and then came 1932. The Bonus Army, tens of thousands of World War I veterans, marched on Washington, demanding early payment of the bonuses they were promised. They set up camp, peaceful, desperate, tired. Hoover sent in the army. Under General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. troops burned the camps to the ground, used tear gas, drove veterans from the Capitol like enemies of the state. Babies died, protesters bled, the country watched it unfold, and Hoover still claimed it was necessary. His presidency wasn't evil in the usual way. It was pathologically unfeeling. He clung to outdated economic models as the nation collapsed into dust and despair. By 1933, the public was done waiting. They wanted action, anything, even if it meant rewriting the social contract. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt. Wheelchair-bound, silver-tongued, and armed with alphabet agencies. He came to save the country, but not without picking his own devils along the way. Franklin D. Roosevelt, the savior who locked the camps. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the closest thing America has had to a benevolent monarch. He reigned for over a decade. He gave the country hope in a time of hunger, direction in a time of despair, and leadership in a time of global annihilation. But the cost of salvation? Selective silence, authoritarian instincts, and 120,000 imprisoned citizens. When FDR took office in 1933, the nation was on its knees. Banks shuttered. Farms failed. Unemployment soared past 25%. FDR responded with the New Deal, a sweeping suite of programs that redefined the role of government, Social Security, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration. He gave people work, hope, bread, and most of all, the feeling that someone was finally in charge. But Roosevelt also played favorites with morality. He courted Southern Democrats to pass his reforms, and in doing so, he allowed the Jim Crow South to remain untouched. Many New Deal programs excluded black workers, particularly in domestic and agricultural sectors. The safety net had holes, and they were racial. Then came World War II. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, FDR signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens. No trials, no charges, just suspicion and xenophobic panic, packaged as national security. Families lost their homes, their farms, their businesses. Children were imprisoned behind barbed wire for years by a president who claimed to fight fascism abroad. Roosevelt's defenders call it a wartime necessity, but the government later admitted it was based on racism, not reason. And FDR never apologized. His administration also turned away the SS Saint Louis, a ship carrying Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler. It returned to Europe. Many of its passengers later died in the Holocaust. FDR was not evil incarnate. He was something trickier, a moral pragmatist, willing to bend any principle in the name of saving the Republic, and he did save it. But the contradictions never healed. His successor would inherit a world war, a shattered Europe, and a bomb that could melt cities in seconds. Harry S. Truman, the man who became death. Harry S. Truman wasn't supposed to be president. He was a compromise candidate, a Missouri machine politician with an honest face and a modest background. He'd only been vice president for 82 days before FDR died, and when he learned about the Manhattan Project, he had no idea the country had even been building a bomb. 3 months later, Truman dropped 2 of them. In August 1945, the U.S. bombed Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 civilians, most of them women, children, and elderly. The cities were flattened, incinerated, irradiated, skin melted from bodies. Shadows were burned into walls. Truman called it a military necessity. He said it saved lives, American lives. He slept soundly that night. But historians, and even some of the scientists behind the bomb, would later question whether Japan was already prepared to surrender, whether the second bomb was necessary, whether Truman dropped them not just to end the war, but to send a message to the Soviet Union. The moral calculus, unclear. The destruction, unforgettable. But Truman didn't stop at nuclear horror. He also oversaw the start of America's Cold War machinery, the birth of the CIA, the national security state, and the doctrine of containment, which would justify coups, assassinations, and proxy wars for the next half-century. He committed American troops to Korea without congressional approval in what became the first war without a declaration of war, a pattern that would become increasingly familiar. And domestically, Truman signed Executive Order 9835, launching a loyalty program that led to the firing of thousands of federal workers for suspected communist sympathies, most without evidence. It paved the way for McCarthyism, blacklists, and fear-based politics. He was a plain-spoken man. He loved to walk, to swear, to play poker, but Truman presided over the most morally consequential moment in human history and pulled the trigger. His legacy? Complex. His successor, a 5-star general who'd later warned the country about the machine he helped build. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who warned too late. Dwight D. Eisenhower won World War II, smiled into cameras, and ran the country like a military operation, quietly, efficiently, and with a deeply controlled sense of detached calm. He brought America peace, prosperity, highways, and the nuclear stockpile of a doomsday cult. Under Eisenhower, the U.S. built over 20,000 nuclear warheads. Bombers patrolled the sky. Submarines circled silently. The policy was called mutually assured destruction, and Ike embraced it like an insurance plan. His logic? If both sides have the bomb, no one dares use it. What he didn't say, accidents happen. He also weaponized the CIA. In 1953, the U.S. overthrew Iran's democratically elected leader, Mohammad Mossadegh, after he nationalized oil fields. Eisenhower approved the operation. In his mind, it was a win for capitalism. In reality, it empowered the Shah, led to brutal repression, and planted the seeds of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. 1 year later, Ike did it again, this time in Guatemala, toppling President Arbenz for daring to redistribute unused land held by United Fruit Company, an American corporation. Again, repression followed. Again, bodies were buried. Again, Eisenhower smiled and played golf. His foreign policy doctrine was simple. Stop communism by any means necessary. It didn't matter who you funded. Death squads, dictators, warlords, as long as they weren't Marxists. Domestically, Eisenhower was more moderate. He funded infrastructure, supported desegregation, grudgingly, and sent federal troops to protect black students in Little Rock when the governor blocked their entry. But he also allowed McCarthyism to fester, staying silent while thousands were blacklisted, careers ruined, and fear metastasized through the cultural bloodstream. And yet, as he left office, Eisenhower issued a warning. In his 1961 farewell address, he spoke of the military-industrial complex, the dangerous merger of profit, politics, and perpetual war. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. He said it softly, too softly, because the next president wouldn't just ignore that warning. He'd dance on it with charm, youth, and missiles aimed at Moscow. John F. Kennedy, the charmer who danced on the edge. John F. Kennedy was a Greek tragedy with perfect hair. He came into office like a starlet, young, glamorous, brilliant, and doomed. He was the promise of Camelot, wrapped in a New England accent, but beneath the charm was a man walking a nuclear tightrope with a blindfold on. His presidency began with failure. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Kennedy inherited the plan from Eisenhower, a covert operation to arm Cuban exiles and overthrow Fidel Castro. JFK signed off. The invasion collapsed in less than 3 days. It was a disaster, militarily, diplomatically, and morally. Instead of apologizing, Kennedy doubled down. He approved Operation Mongoose, a CIA campaign to sabotage Cuba, sabotage factories, poison Castro's cigars, explode his scuba gear. If it sounded like a Bond film, that's because it was, just with more plausible deniability and more dead people. Then came October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days where the world teetered on the edge of nuclear war. Soviet missiles in Cuba, U.S. warships forming a blockade. The whole planet held its breath while two men played chicken with apocalypse. Kennedy's calm demeanor disguised the fact that the military wanted to invade, use nukes, escalate. Kennedy said no. He cut a deal with Khrushchev. U.S. missiles out of Turkey, Soviet missiles out of Cuba. He saved the world, temporarily, but let's not canonize him yet. Kennedy ramped up America's involvement in Vietnam, sending in military advisors and laying the foundation for a war that would destroy a generation. He authorized covert coups in Congo, Laos, South Vietnam, all in the name of stopping communism. At home, he was slow on civil rights, reluctant, pressured by activists and public horror. He finally gave a strong speech in 1963 and was assassinated 5 months later. He became a myth, a martyr, a mosaic of half-truths and perfectly lit shadows. But the machinery he helped build, the covert ops, the Cold War paranoia, the imperial presidency, didn't die with him. It grew teeth under his successor. Lyndon B. Johnson was coming, and he would give America civil rights and Vietnam in the same clenched fist. Lyndon B. Johnson, the idealist who lit Vietnam on fire. Lyndon B. Johnson was the most Shakespearean of all presidents, a titan of will and contradiction, rising from the Texas Hill Country with dust on his boots and a vendetta against poverty. He knew how to get things done, twist arms, make threats, smile through gritted teeth. He had a dreamer's pen and a thug's toolkit, and for a brief, staggering moment, he tried to remake America into something moral. He signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He created Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and PBS. His Great Society program was the most ambitious liberal agenda since the New Deal. He told aides, "We have the opportunity to move not only toward the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the Great Society." But then, Vietnam. He escalated a conflict that should have been a footnote and turned it into a meat grinder for ideology. Based on the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a sketchy naval skirmish that may not have happened the way it was reported, Johnson got Congress to give him a blank check for war, and he cashed it. From 1965 to 1968, he sent over 500,000 U.S. troops into the jungles of Vietnam. He authorized carpet bombings, Agent Orange, and search and destroy missions that burned entire villages to ash. More than 58,000 Americans died. Up to 3 million Vietnamese were killed. many of them civilians, and he knew it wasn't working. He listened to the generals lie. He listened to the advisors panic. Privately, he told friends, I can't fight this damn war and build the great society at the same time. But he kept going. For political pride, for fear of looking weak, for Cold War optics. By 1968, his presidency was unraveling in real time. Protests, riots, assassinations, chaos. He shocked the nation by not seeking re-election, effectively exiling himself from the empire he tried to fix and broke instead. LBJ's legacy is a contradiction chiseled in stone, the man who fought for the poor and slaughtered the innocent, the architect of civil rights who watched his own war, drowned those dreams in napalm. And when he left a country cracked open, waiting for a strong hand to steady the ship. Unfortunately, the next guy was Richard Nixon, and Nixon brought tape recorders, secret wars, and a bunker mentality. Richard Nixon, the crook who won anyway. Richard Milhouse Nixon was a man terrified of shadows, but always willing to cast his own. He came to power as a law and order president, a patriot, a master of foreign policy. And then he spent the next 6 years systematically dismantling trust in government. Let's start with what he did right, because even villains get lucky. He ended the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, eventually, opened diplomatic relations with China, the first president to do so, signed arms limitation treaties with the Soviets, created the Environmental Protection Agency, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and Title IX. He gave America the infrastructure of liberalism, then sold it out for power. Because Nixon's genius wasn't in leadership, it was in paranoia. He authorized covert bombings of Cambodia and Laos without telling Congress, the press, or the American people. The secret war destabilized Southeast Asia and helped birth the Khmer Rouge, a genocidal regime that would slaughter over 2 million Cambodians. Back home, he used the FBI, CIA, and IRS to spy on political enemies, sabotage activists, and crush dissent. And then came Watergate. It started with a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. It ended with the unraveling of a presidency. Nixon denied involvement, then covered it up, then obstructed justice, then lied about lying, then refused to hand over White House tapes that recorded every curse, threat, and whispered scheme. He famously said, "When the president does it, that means that it is not illegal." By 1974, the game was up. Impeachment was imminent. Nixon resigned in disgrace, the only president ever to do so. He boarded a helicopter, waved goodbye, and left behind a nation that no longer trusted its leaders, its institutions, or its own moral compass. But justice never came, because the next man, Gerald Ford, let it all slide. Gerald Ford, the man who let it slide. Gerald Ford was never elected president or vice president. He was a backup quarterback who stumbled into the Oval Office because the starters all got indicted. He was earnest, decent, and deeply boring. A man who tried to restore honor to a government drowning in scandal, and then he committed the most controversial pardon in U.S. history. 1 month after taking office, Ford granted Richard Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed while in office. The country was stunned. No trial, no investigation, no reckoning. Just a clean legal slate. Ford claimed it was to help the nation heal, to move forward. But to millions, it felt like the ultimate cover-up, power protecting power. And that's the paradox of Ford. He wasn't evil. He just believed in institutions more than accountability. He tried to fix inflation with a slogan, "Whip inflation now," and handed out buttons. Inflation laughed. He oversaw the final collapse of South Vietnam, where desperate Vietnamese citizens clung to helicopters as U.S. forces fled the embassy rooftop. The war Nixon tried to end and Johnson tried to win ended in utter humiliation. And while Ford posed as the calm center, the country spun around him, economically, culturally, politically. The 1970s were not a time for decency. They were a time for revenge, cynicism, and oil shortages. The next president would ride into office on a wave of post-Watergate disillusionment, promising moral clarity and truth. Instead, he'd fund future terrorists. Jimmy Carter, the Sunday school cipher who armed the future. Jimmy Carter came into office like a moral exorcism. the soft-spoken Baptist from Georgia, offering truth after Watergate and technocratic humility after the Nixon-Ford hangover. He was a man of character, deeply ethical, a naval engineer, peanut farmer, and Sunday school teacher who promised, "I'll never lie to you," and he didn't, but that didn't make him harmless. Domestically, Carter struggled. Inflation raged. Oil prices spiked. The Iran hostage crisis turned his presidency into a TV countdown of humiliation. He delivered speeches about national malaise, which, while honest, sounded a lot like blaming the audience. But it's in foreign policy where Carter left his quiet scorch marks, because beneath the sermons and solar panels, Carter greenlit one of the most dangerous covert operations in modern history, Operation Cyclone. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Carter's response? Send billions of dollars in arms and training to Afghan mujahideen, anti-communist rebels fighting the Soviets. On paper, heroic freedom fighters. In reality, the ideological ancestors of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. We didn't just fund future terrorists. We taught them how to fight, supplied them with weapons, trained them in sabotage, planted the seeds for decades of blowback. All because we couldn't resist playing chess on someone else's graveyard. Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, famously said, "What is more important? A few stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe?" History's answer: both mattered, but the price was paid in skyscrapers. Carter also did little to stop the rise of brutal right-wing regimes in Latin America. Under his watch, military juntas in El Salvador and Guatemala were armed and trained, with bodies piling up in villages, rivers, and shallow graves. And yet, Carter's post-presidency became his redemption arc, building houses for the poor, monitoring elections, writing poetry about peace. He may have been the best former president, but while in office, his attempts to be righteous created unrighteous legacies. And the next president, he didn't try to be righteous, he just made being wrong look good. A B-movie cowboy turned messiah for free market fundamentalists. Ronald Reagan was coming, and he brought Hollywood with him. Ronald Reagan, the smile behind the sabotage. Ronald Reagan had the voice of a bedtime story and the policies of a wrecking ball in slow motion. He promised morning in America. What he delivered was midnight for the poor, twilight for the truth, and a long nuclear dusk for the rest of the world. Reagan's presidency was a performance, the White House recast as a soundstage where deficit spending, deregulation, and death squads could be sold as liberty, prosperity, and freedom. Let's start with the economy. Reaganomics. He cut taxes for the wealthy, slashed social programs, deregulated banks, and tripled the national debt. The poor got crumbs, the rich got caviar. Homelessness exploded. The working class shrank. Wall Street boomed. He broke the Air Traffic Controllers Union in 1981, firing over 11,000 federal employees for striking. It was a warning shot to all organized labor: fall in line or disappear. And then came the crack epidemic, a drug crisis that exploded in black communities. Instead of treatment, Reagan launched the war on drugs, turning addiction into incarceration, mandatory minimums, no-knock raids, 3 strikes laws. The prison population soared. An entire generation was locked up, not lifted up. But Reagan's most grotesque legacy was abroad. In Central America, he funded and armed right-wing death squads under the banner of anti-communism. In El Salvador, US-backed forces committed massacres, like El Mozote, where over 800 civilians were slaughtered. In Guatemala, the Reagan-supported regime of Efrain Rios Montt carried out genocide against indigenous Mayan communities. Reagan called him a man of great personal integrity. Then came Iran-Contra. Reagan's administration sold arms to Iran, a sworn enemy, and used the money to fund Nicaraguan Contras, a rebel group accused of drug trafficking, torture, and rape. It was illegal, immoral, unconstitutional. Reagan claimed he didn't know, which either makes him a liar or a figurehead. Take your pick. He also ignored the AIDS epidemic for years. Thousands of deaths, mostly gay men, dismissed with silence and smirks from his press secretary. And yet, Reagan remains a conservative icon. The myth is polished. The statue stands tall. because the Gipper always smiled, even while the world burned behind him. And the next president, a man who'd watched it all from the inside, who ran the CIA, who kept secrets the way other people breathe. George H.W. Bush, a velvet glove over a shadow state. George H.W. Bush, the director of Unseen Wars. George H.W. Bush was not a cowboy. He was a Yale man, a spy master, a diplomat with blood under his fingernails and a blue tie around his neck. While Reagan did the talking, Bush did the whispering. He ran the CIA, he ran the UN, he ran the campaign. Eventually, he ran the country, and he did it like a man moving chess pieces behind glass. His presidency was built on quiet violence, surgical war, and PR-friendly patriotism. Start with Panama, 1989. Operation Just Cause. The U.S. invaded to oust dictator Manuel Noriega, once a CIA asset, now inconvenient. Troops bombed Panama City. Hundreds, possibly thousands, of civilians died. But Bush got a quick win and a TV special. Then came Desert Storm, the Gulf War. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Bush built a global coalition and launched a 100-hour ground war, backed by months of aerial bombardment. It was swift, spectacular, and sanitized by U.S. media. But here's the catch. After urging Iraqi civilians and Kurds to rise up against Saddam, Bush left them hanging. U.S. forces withdrew, and Saddam crushed the uprisings with tanks and executions. Thousands died. Bush said nothing. And at home, he laid the groundwork for modern mass incarceration. The 1990 crime bill poured money into police and prisons. The Willie Horton ad, aired during his campaign, stoked racist fears of black criminality and reshaped political advertising forever. Yet Bush also signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed Clean Air Act amendments. His environmental policies were oddly progressive. He was a man of contradictions, refined, ruthless, reserved. But his greatest legacy may be this. He helped build a post-Cold War empire, one that would eventually be inherited by his son. Bill Clinton, the sax man who sold the working class. Bill Clinton was the American dream in human form. Born poor, rose fast, charming enough to make scandal look sexy. He played sax on late-night TV, bit his lip when he lied, and turned the White House into a cocktail party with nuclear codes. But while he danced through the 1990s, his policies hollowed out the soul of the working class. Clinton ran as a new Democrat, promising balance, tough on crime, friendly to Wall Street, and reform-minded. In practice, that meant triangulating morals into mush. Let's talk about welfare reform. In 1996, Clinton signed the Personal Responsibility in Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, effectively ending welfare as an entitlement program. It imposed work requirements, time limits, and forced millions of poor Americans, mostly single mothers, into deeper poverty. He framed it as empowerment. It was abandonment dressed in a press release. And then there was NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Clinton pushed it through, promising jobs and prosperity. What followed? A mass exodus of American manufacturing, the decimation of Rust Belt economies, and a slow drip of desperation that never left. And if you were poor and black, welcome to Mass Incarceration 2.0. Clinton's 1994 crime bill expanded the death penalty, built more prisons, and escalated the war on drugs. He boasted about putting 100,000 new cops on the street. What he didn't mention? The bill disproportionately targeted communities of color, swelling the prison population to historic highs. He claimed it was what the people wanted. He later admitted it was a mistake, but the damage was done. Internationally, Clinton bombed Iraq weekly, enforced deadly sanctions that killed 500,000 children, and launched a NATO bombing campaign in Yugoslavia without UN approval. He also dismantled Glass-Steagall, letting banks become too big to fail, a fuse that would explode in 2008. And then there was Monica. Yes, he had an affair with 22-year-old intern. Yes, he lied about it under oath. Yes, he was impeached. But the real scandal wasn't sex. It was that the same administration that deregulated Wall Street and gutted the safety net still managed to be beloved by liberals. Because Clinton didn't kill the left, he seduced it. And the next man didn't need seduction. He came from Texas. He liked nicknames and Jesus and photo ops on aircraft carriers. George W. Bush was here. And he was about to show the world what American freedom looked like at 30,000 feet, with a payload. George W. Bush, the frat boy who lit the world on fire. George W. Bush spoke like a cartoon sheriff and governed like an oil baron with a Bible. He was the president of 9/11, the War on Terror, the Patriot Act, and the collapse of nearly every moral boundary the country claimed to stand on. He ran as a compassionate conservative. What followed was 20 years of blood, surveillance, and lies. Let's start with Iraq. After September 11th, Bush invaded Afghanistan, a war the public supported briefly. But he didn't stop there. In 2003, under the banner of weapons of mass destruction, Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq, a country that had nothing to do with 9/11 and no WMDs. What it did have? Oil, a former ally turned enemy in Saddam Hussein, and a spot on the map we wanted to redraw. The war was sold through fear, mushroom clouds, mobile weapons labs, terrorist ties. None of it was true. Over 1 million Iraqis died. Thousands of American troops were killed. Millions more displaced. Entire regions destabilized. Torture sites like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay became household names. The CIA waterboarded suspects. The public shrugged. And at home, Bush signed the Patriot Act, giving the government the power to spy on its own citizens without warrants. Libraries tracked your reading. Phones were tapped. Muslims were surveilled, detained, and harassed. He botched Hurricane Katrina, leaving thousands to drown in the ruins of a black city, while he praised FEMA from a photo op. He gave the rich tax cuts, gave Wall Street a blank check, gave defense contractors billions to rebuild the very countries we destroyed. And when the economy finally cracked in 2008, he left a scorched earth presidency and handed the keys to a man who promised hope. But hope, it turns out, can fly a drone too. Barack Obama, the drone poet laureate of liberal empire. Barack Obama was a symbol before he was a president. A black man with a name like a jazz solo, elected on the promise that America could be better, kinder, smarter, human again. And in some ways, it was. He passed the Affordable Care Act, repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, restored diplomacy with Cuba, and negotiated a nuclear deal with Iran. But behind the eloquence and policy wins, Obama built a technologically refined war machine, sanitized, streamlined, and almost invisible. He expanded the drone program to historic levels, authorizing hundreds of airstrikes in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and beyond. These weren't battlefields, they were zones of interest. Wedding parties were bombed. Journalists, children, civilians misidentified as militants. The term signature strike was invented under his watch, meaning you could be killed by a drone not for who you were, but for what your behavior resembled. No trial, no name, just vaporized, then reviewed on a PowerPoint. He deported more immigrants than any president before him, oversaw the militarization of police, used the Espionage Act more than all previous presidents combined to prosecute whistleblowers. And when Wall Street collapsed the economy, Obama bailed out the banks, not the homeowners. He saved the system, not the people caught beneath it. And yet, we loved him, or needed to, because he was calm, witty, presidential. He wore dignity like a tailored suit, but his administration proved that imperial violence didn't need to look evil anymore. It could look like progress. He left office beloved and haunted, cheered by millions, stalked by ghosts, and he left behind a country primed for its final contradiction. Because the next man didn't hide the empire, he tweeted it. Donald Trump, the clown king of collapse. Donald Trump wasn't a president in the traditional sense. He was a phenomenon, a wrecking ball and bronzer, a sentient middle finger raised at the 21st century. He began his campaign by calling Mexican immigrants racists, promising a wall, and attacking war heroes. And instead of ending his run, it launched it. He won in 2016, not because he hid the rot, but because he fed on it. Once in office, Trump redefined American governance, not through laws, but through chaos. He hired reality TV villains as cabinet secretaries, turned press briefings into performance art, replaced policy with slogans, build the wall, drain the swamp, lock her up. His most evil act, there are too many, but the family separation policy at the border might be the most viscerally cruel. Children, some as young as toddlers, were torn from their parents under a zero-tolerance immigration directive. They were held in cages, lost in paperwork, some never reunited. Hundreds are still unaccounted for. He claimed it was necessary. It was trauma as policy, sadism in bureaucracy. And then came COVID-19. Trump downplayed the virus, mocked masks, and turned a public health crisis into a partisan loyalty test. Over 1 million Americans died. Many could have lived. But the briefings were about optics, not oxygen. He blamed China, then the Democrats, then Anthony Fauci, never himself. And in the final days of his presidency, Trump gave us the coup that wasn't. January 6th, 2021, the Capitol riot. He summoned supporters, encouraged them, watched the chaos unfold on TV, and then refused to call them off for hours. Flags were replaced with zip ties. Offices were looted, blood was spilled. He was impeached. Again, and acquitted. Again. And what did he do in the aftermath? Fundraised, played golf, claimed victimhood. Donald Trump did not break the presidency. He simply showed us how broken it already was, how easily it could be hijacked by ego, grievance, and branding. And the man who followed him? A ghost from an older script, familiar, grinning, worn thin by history. Joe Biden, America's comfort food in crisis. But comfort, as we've seen, is not always moral. Joe Biden, the whispering caretaker of empire. Joe Biden ran on restoration, normalcy, decency, empathy. And for many, just hearing full sentences again was a balm. But what Biden offered wasn't transformation. It was maintenance. The presidency as hospice care for a dying system. He ended the U.S. war in Afghanistan, but did so chaotically, leaving allies stranded, the Taliban resurgent, and an entire nation confused about what 2 decades of war had accomplished. He passed massive spending bills, sent checks, promised vaccines, promised racial justice, climate reform, police reform, voting rights. Most of it died in the Senate. Some of it died in silence. Biden approved more oil drilling than Trump, greenlit the Willow Project, a massive fossil fuel initiative in the Arctic. He claimed to care about the climate, and then expanded fossil infrastructure. He called Saudi Arabia a pariah, then fist-bumped MBS in Riyadh for oil. And when Israel bombed Gaza in 2023 and 2024, Biden sent weapons, vetoed ceasefire resolutions at the UN, and issued boilerplate statements about Israel's right to defend itself. Even as civilian death tolls skyrocketed, he said he lost sleep over the war, but not enough to stop funding it. And back home, he tried to be the anti-Trump. He whispered empathy, but his immigration policies grew sharper. His police funding increased. His support for unions came with caveats. He governed like a man trying to balance on a crumbling bridge, with one hand reaching for the New Deal, and the other held out to the people who set the fire. Joe Biden did not redefine the office. He merely preserved its hollow rituals. So here we are, 45 men, each entrusted with the moral engine of a nation, each gifted the pen, the sword, the stage. Each, in their own way, chose power over principle. They expanded slavery, burned villages, overthrew governments, signed death warrants, watched people drown, listened to lies and called it security, sent drones, sent soldiers, sent thoughts and prayers. Some smiled while doing it. Some wept. Most just signed the paperwork and walked away. This isn't a eulogy or an indictment. It's just the ledger. Because if the presidency teaches us anything, it's that the higher the office, the more elegant the evil. In America, it keeps writing the job description in blood and calling it leadership.